Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country, and thank you for joining our webinar, Managing Change During an Unprecedented Times. Do you have a plan? Presented by BC Solutions. I'd like to introduce our speakers, Jean Stanley and Mary Lieb. Jean has worked in healthcare for over 40 years. She received her MBA in Healthcare Administration, is certified as a specialist in blood banking, a quality manager of organizational excellence, a quality auditor, and Six Sigma Black Belt through the American Society of Quality. In addition to working in hospital transfusion services and blood centers, both on the bench and in managerial roles, Jean's experience includes working as a lean specialist for volumetric services for ortho clinical diagnostics and as a healthcare consultant working in Central Asia and Ukraine. She currently is Senior Manager of Medical Affairs for blood screening at Roche Molecular Diagnostics. Mary graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in Medical Technology from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Mary received her specialty in blood banking in 1988, and in 2005, she became a certified quality auditor from the American Society of Quality. In 2009, she achieved a green belt in Lean Six Sigma. Her experience ranges from managing level 1 trauma-based transfusion services in a large tertiary care teaching hospital to a quality consultant. She is a CAP inspector as well as an AABB assessor with national and international experience. Currently, she is providing support to the Blood Bank of Hawaii as a quality and IRL technical consultant. And when not working, she is Nana to 2 very busy grandchildren. Thank you to both of you, and I will turn it over to Jean to start the webinar.
Thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure to be here today. Well, certainly under these unprecedented times, we've been challenged both personally and professionally. The SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has turned our worlds upside down, made worse with natural events such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and fires that seem to be worse this year than before. So first, I'd like to just thank all of you in healthcare who are doing your part during this pandemic to help others. It is greatly appreciated. And our hearts go out to those who are being impacted or have been impacted by these natural events, and for instance, with Hurricane Laura and with the fires in the West. There are many factors to consider when preparing for a disaster, including putting together a business continuity plan and crisis management plan. But what happened when the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic appeared? Did it totally disrupt our operations? Did our plans help? Are we able to manage the multiple changes that seem to be happening almost daily? Next. Today, we will focus on a few critical elements as they relate to crisis management in the laboratory and how we have had to manage change to address the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. However, these critical elements can also apply to any business. So we will talk about a business continuity and crisis management plan, the importance of leadership and communication, staffing considerations, supply chain shortages, IT requirements, and of course regulatory requirements, and we'll wrap it up with lessons learned. So let's first distinguish the difference between a business continuity plan and a crisis management plan. Next. Every organization should have a business continuity plan in place as part of their emergency management plan. The purpose of the plan is focused on the business aspects of the organization or those essential operations necessary to function during and after an emergency or disaster, including what are the processes and procedures that will be followed. Next. Prior to the development of the plan, the organization needs to assemble a planning team. This should be a cross-functional team with experts from administration, including HR, legal, communications, finance, IT, and operations. We can also have a department-based team as a subset of the organizational team. So for instance, like in the laboratory, we may have our own team with representatives from each of the departments. The team should analyze the current situation or environment and perform a risk assessment to identify those critical functions that are required to continue operations. For example, in the laboratory, how will patients be received for blood draws? How will we receive samples from external customers? What testing will be provided? What about staffing? What is the impact on IT functions? The next step is to develop the plan. Here, the plan addresses safety of employees, communication both internally and externally, and actions to be taken for infrastructure recovery, including IT facilities and operations. Another crucial factor to include in our plan is a list of contacts for key staff so that we're not scrambling to find phone numbers and other information during this event. And another thing would be to have a temporary succession plan for critical roles in the event that those persons are unavailable or incapacitated. So for instance, who is going to take over for the lab director or manager if they are unavailable? And most importantly, the plan should be tested to see that it will work as expected. This means running a drill and evaluating the plan and revising it as necessary. Additional training of staff may also be needed, and this plan should be reviewed every year to ensure it is up to date. Next. The next step is to develop a crisis response strategy. We will need to develop more than one strategy to address the different types of emergencies or disasters that could occur, such as for hurricanes, tornadoes, or fires, depending on where you are located, cyber attacks, domestic attacks, and pandemic, to name a few. There should be a dedicated team to manage each type of crisis or incident, and this is separate from the business continuity team, as it is focused on that specific incident, and therefore may require different expertise. For example, a cyber attack may require different expertise versus from a pandemic. The 5 phases in a crisis management plan are listed here and can overlap depending on what is happening. Situational awareness is where we monitor and assess data or information. So we need to consider where will we get this information. Then decide based on the information what conditions would trigger a response. Asking questions such as what would be the impact on the organization, on our staff, on supplies, IT, and other operations. Again, here we are making an assessment specific to the type of crisis. For example, with the pandemic, we heard about reports of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in China, and then we heard about the spread of the virus to Europe. So when did this trigger a response? Was it then, or did we wait until we heard about the first reported case here in the US? Next is mitigation. What can we do ahead of time to reduce or eliminate the disruption? For example, in areas where earthquakes occur, labs have installed straps and braces for securing large pieces of equipment to prevent them from moving or falling. We can also run exercises or drills to practice our response to a particular crisis. In addition to mitigation, we want to prepare. We want to ask questions such as what resources will be needed? Do we have enough inventory of supplies? How will we make sure that we get our deliveries if normal routes are not feasible? Who is in charge? How will we make decisions? How will we communicate? These are just a few of the questions that we may need to address. And then during the crisis, we will respond. We will put the plan into action. And then finally, the last phase will be recovery. What and how do we get back to normal or a new normal? And I'll cover that later. Next. So now let's take a look at a few critical elements for managing change and how we respond during a crisis. Let's start with leadership. In general, managing change can be difficult for people. In a situation like COVID, it can be harder due to personal anxieties and concerns about the pandemic. Leaders need to focus on their employees first, and then to the business outside. First, employees need to feel safe and secure in their work environment. This includes providing the appropriate personal protective equipment, or PPE, necessary to keep staff safe while performing their job, providing barriers to prevent unnecessary exposure, and perhaps reassignment of job duties. Mary will address this further a little later in the presentation. Communication is always important, and it is probably the #1 trait of leadership, especially in a crisis. Employees are looking to leadership for guidance. This involves all levels of leaders within the organization, from the CEO down to the frontline supervisor. As leaders, we also need to communicate clearly and consistently and with a sense of purpose, providing a sense of calm and assurance of what needs to be done. Our employees are expecting their leaders to be forward-looking and offering hope. In addition, leaders need to be accessible and respond with transparency. So it's okay to say you don't know the answer to a question. We also need to show empathy for how our staff are feeling. And I'm sure with the COVID pandemic, a lot of us have felt a sense of loss or isolation, especially if we're working from home. We may also be feeling overwhelmed, especially those people that are working from home. Their work environment is not really geared up, or rather their home environment is not really geared up to have an office, and they may have interruptions from family members, such as parenting duties, including distance learning with their children. So it's important that we have regular check-ins to make sure that our employees are doing okay. And teamwork and collaboration are also important. We want to empower employees to be innovative and come up with suggestions for addressing current challenges and also looking longer term. So go ahead, try out a suggestion with a sprint or rapid improvement event, or use the PDCA cycle of improvement and see if it works. And then also be prepared to provide honest feedback. Next. So communicate, communicate, communicate. It is so important. And so whom do we communicate with? Well, of course, as I said, with our employees, but we also need to consider our outside customers, such as our vendors, who can help us, especially with the supply situation. They're our partners, or they want to be our partners. And then, of course, the customers, our physicians, how they're getting their results, if they have questions about the test, with the patients. And if we're, for instance, if hospitals are our customers, such as blood centers, you need to be able to communicate with them as well. And then, as patients, as you've probably heard, is that the number of telemedicine visits has just really rapidly increased. In fact, there was a report out at the end of July by Health and Human Services that said that the number of telemedicine visits had increased to greater than 50% compared to a pre-pandemic period. And I'm sure this is probably going to be part of our new norm. How do we communicate? Well, there are multiple channels or platforms that we can use, perhaps through daily huddles or stand-up meetings, email updates, newsletters, town halls. And for those non-essential workers who are working from home, communication certainly has changed from in-person to digital tools like video conferencing, internal internet sites for updates, and hotlines. So again, it is important that we maintain that connection with our team. Next. So again, we need to have communication at all levels within the organization. We need to hear from the executive management that are providing kind of a big picture of what's going on and what we are doing. And then we have our middle management, which is more concerned with the operations. And in the laboratory, even though we are more likely to see each other in person, we still need to communicate. So on a department level, we should be having employee check-ins as well as daily huddles. So now, Mary will continue with staffing considerations.
Hello, everybody. When we talk about staffing, you know, that is the boots on the ground folks that really make the wheels turn for any process or any job duty. So first of all, when we're talking about staffing, we have to determine what task at this given point would be that can be done virtual. Who are essential employees that need to be on site versus those employees that can work from home. And I think one of the things that have occurred with this pandemic is that I think it's changed a little bit from executive management down to the staff level as to what actually can be done at home and done effectively. And so that may change our new normal as we work our way through this pandemic. We also need to consider HR requirements. There are federal and state laws. Now, the federal laws, of course, for the land, for the whole land. The state laws depend on the state. So you have to be aware of what your state laws actually say, and they can be more stringent than the federal laws. So you have to be aware of that. and particularly family leave. There are some states that extend family leave for more different kinds of considerations that extend beyond what the federal government has said. So you really need to know that and work towards that. You have to reevaluate work and staffing schedules. You know, we're supposed to keep a distance, and we're supposed to not be on top of each other when we're working. So you may, instead of having everybody on one shift, you may tend to extend your shifts so that you don't have as much overlap of individuals, and they will be working maybe a little more on their own, but individually, so that they don't come in contact with other people. If they can avoid it. This is something that I have seen done recently for an IRL that has been all daylight, and now their hours go from 7 in the morning till midnight to spread out the staffing, and the work is such that they're able to do that. I think it's very important to create teams with your staff and your middle management so that you can extend hours and you can have a fallback plan. What happens if your staff becomes sick? You already have, you know, you may have people that are out for family leave. You have to have like plan A, plan B, plan C. If you have full staff, these are the shifts that you have. If you're down to 50% of your staff, perhaps some of that work either needs to be batched so that it's only done once or twice a week, or perhaps you are able to send it out or have another laboratory do it. And obviously we're talking in terms of hospitals and blood centers and those kinds of things. And also job reassignment. What happens if you have an aging population like some of us are in the laboratory world, where we are considered high risk because of our age and maybe some of our coexisting conditions that we've developed in our advanced years. And so we have to be evaluated, and where do we work? Maybe we can't, if it's a phlebotomist, perhaps they're not going to be able to interface with patients on the floor. So these are the kinds of things that you need to think about. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about virtual leadership, because I don't know about all of you out there, but I know that this has really impacted some of the work that I'm doing at this current point in time, and I know Jean also. You have to have established, regularly scheduled communication. It can't be sporadic. You can have huddles in the morning. You can have a quick call. You can determine whatever the mode of communication is going to be. Are you going to Zoom? Are you going to FaceTime? Or are you just going to make a phone call? The goal is really, the important part of this goal is to achieve an emotional connection. You don't want people that have to work at home that are virtual, and also the leadership, if they're working from home, to feel disconnected. You need to feel connected and have that emotional confidence that the communication is clear and trusted. And you also have to empower employees to be able to do some things. If leadership is not present on site and employees are, you have to give a little and empower the employees to be able to make certain kinds of decisions. But that's where the clarity comes in, and that's where you have to have concise guidelines that perhaps are written down. And again, we come back to flexibility. I have found you just really need to keep calm and hear what's happening, and just be able to work around certain circumstances. And maybe you're going to find different ways to approach them than you did in the past. And you have to be open to that. And that's difficult. I will not tell you it's easy. It's a difficult thing. Next slide. So how do we stay connected to our coworkers? Well, first of all, you have to take care of yourself. And if you realize that, you realize that life happens, and it doesn't just happen to you, it happens to everybody. So Jean talked about empathy. You really have to be empathetic, not only to your coworkers, but to yourself. If you can't get to something, or if something comes up and you can't meet a virtual commitment, just be honest about it, be clear, and let someone else be able to take that responsibility. you have to have realistic expectations with everybody, with the line staff as well as the management staff. And again, I highly recommend having written requirements as to what, as a leader, your expectations are for your line staff, so that if it's written down, they know exactly what's expected of them, especially during uncertain times. It's really important for the staff to feel confident that they understand what you need them to do. And then you've got socials. You know, if you're a social creature and you're not an introvert, you'd like to be able to stay in contact and find out what's happening with someone's family, with your coworkers. How are they doing? Well, there are some places that do Thirsty Thursdays, and that could be an adult libation, or it could be a coffee clutch, or it could be a soft drink, or it could just be the drink of your choice, and getting together at the end of the day in a virtual kind of way, be able to have a Zoom meeting and be able to talk to each other, not about work, but maybe about just how are things going? How's your family? You know, what have you guys been doing? What TV shows are you watching? What are you binging on? It's that kind of thing. Next slide. So now Jean is going to talk about supply chain and what needs to happen with our supplies and how do we maintain them. Jean?
Thank you, Mary. So one of the biggest challenges that laboratories and hospitals have had is how to manage supplies. At first, there was the shortage of PPE, especially with the N95 mask, but also with gloves and gowns. We've also seen shortages with supplies for collecting samples, and this has caused delays downstream for testing. And with the FDA granting EUAs for so many different tests and platforms, it's really been difficult to keep up. Shortages with reagents and consumables has led supply manufacturers to place allocations on instruments and reagents. And so this has resulted in some laboratories implementing multiple platforms for testing. And this in itself can be a challenge with multiple validations, SOPs, training, IT resulting, and so forth. And to top it off, with the number of natural disasters and events occurring of late, we've also seen delays in receipt of supplies. Next. So often people are asking, is just-in-time delivery or JIT delivery still apply? In my opinion, yes, it does, but you need to identify your risks. We may need to reevaluate our own levels of safety stock, as well as those of the supplier. Some questions that we may want to consider, or some risks that we may want to consider with suppliers, is where are their hubs located? Are they close to where we are, or are they across the US? What is their safety stock? And what is their ability to increase inventory if needed? And what kind of turnaround time are we talking about? And perhaps more importantly, who are their suppliers of raw materials? What is their backup plan? We may also find that we may need to have dual suppliers in this case. We should also consider our local businesses, which have pivoted from manufacturing whatever they do for their business to now making supplies that we need. For instance, I read where a window shade company was making face shields, and breweries and wineries are making hand sanitizer, and even a floor company was making gowns. We also have schools that are using their 3D printers to make face shields. So basically, our local business can really help us. And for these small businesses, it can really be a win-win collaboration. We're helping to keep their employees working, and they're providing healthcare with the needed supplies. Next. Next. The FDA has also lists of alternative supplies for testing on their websites, and I've listed a couple links here. Remember, however, that you may still need to do validation of those supplies before you actually use them. There's also been a lot of talk about pooling samples to save on supplies and reagents. However, there are some considerations before you implement pooling, including, who's being tested. It's really not meant for diagnostic use for identifying patients with SARS-CoV-2. It's more for a surveillance testing for asymptomatic people. What is the prevalence of the virus in the community? We know that if the prevalence is too high, that pooling is only going to create more work because you're going to have more positives, and then you're going to have to break down those pools to identify the positive. Thus, you're using more supplies and reagents as well as more labor. And the other thing to consider is with pooled testing, you also have decreased sensitivity as you're diluting the sample with multiple individual samples compared to testing with each sample individually. And finally, a laboratory must validate the process and obtain an EUA from the FDA before they can actually implement the test. Next. And Mary will now continue talking about IT requirements.
When we talk about IT requirements and setting up a virtual office, I found that it wasn't as simple as what I thought it maybe should have been. IT support, you really have to make friends with your IT department to really have a smooth transition to having a home office. IT support is required to work from home. A lot of times IT is now working from home and they're not where they can do whatever their magic is where they are. But how responsive is your IT department? And that can be from soup to nuts, and only you can answer that. So you know if it's an obstacle or if it's a positive thing, you know your work may or be cut out for you, or it might be a simple thing. One of the other things is a VPN connection to your laboratory information system. Do you need access to patient information, patient records, work files? Can you VPN in? Is it encrypted? How tight is your IT department in terms of allowing you in and out of what you need to get into? And as far as file transfers, I am an assessor, and I was at a facility actually yesterday doing an assessment, and I was having trouble getting into the guest Wi-Fi. And when I called the IT hotline, which I was told to call, they told me they didn't support the guest Wi-Fi. So it was interesting. It was the help desk, and they weren't very helpful. And it was a challenge, and I was able to get in, but it wasn't because IT helped. It was because people on site had some of those same issues and were able to work around it. You have to have adequate bandwidth, and you have to have human resource support. You know, there's got to be people at both ends if you need to communicate. Also, where is that information found? Is it in the cloud, or is it on a server? Or it could be both, or it could be, I'm not sure where sometimes. So these are the kinds of questions when you're setting up a virtual office and you have virtual processes you have to think about. How do you do electronic signatures if you have to review QC? What's the process? Do you need to have an additional application like a little signing electron pad, or can you do it through Adobe? And how do you do it? Who's going to show you how to do it? I have found that I've learned many things on my own, and I'm hanging in there and doing okay, but it's a challenge. And so, and also, whose equipment? If you're going to work from home, are you going to use your computer, or are you going to use work computers? There are many places that if it's your computer and something happens with access, the IT people won't work on a personal computer, but they'll work on a work computer. So again, these are the kinds of things you need to think about. Next slide. Also, with IT requirements, we're talking about a virtual office. Now we're talking about additional tests and a new blood product that has come out of nowhere. And how do we handle that? Well, many places have developed a little packet that they have for IT as well as laboratory to add tests, to add new codes, to add new testing methodologies. And it's a validation packet with the forms, the basic forms and the templates that you need so that they're ready to customize, and you can just go ahead and start putting your test and your product, giving them the information they need to build your test. Just-in-time validation is usually what happens. You're not going to be able to do it in advance. And Validation and training generally go hand in hand. If you have to validate something and somebody needs to learn it, they should do the validation because it will help them learn it prior to implementation. So you have to have SOPs, you have to have your workflow processes defined, your validation outlined, your training structure and your training documents ready to go with your test scripts. And after all of that's done and approved, you can implement. And I think many times with a new blood product, you really have to have a conversation with your blood center and the software vendors about what you need to implement. Test codes change, methods change. I can tell you there are so many different tests for COVID at this given point in time. It will make your head spin. And I can't even imagine how that is actually being handled smoothly. How do you result out the molecular, the antigen and the antibody testing? Examples of blood product labels have to come from your vendor so that you can scan them into your computer and do your validation. There are new product codes for COVID that have been given to us by ICHBA, which I will share with you. And you have to have a process to address receiving an unexpected product type that might be imported. Everybody's getting CCP plasma from all over the United States. And if you're regional, you're used to what your blood center did. So when you get something from the Northeast and you are in the Midwest and they have a different kind of plasma collected that you've never seen, you have to get that into your computer or you can't use that product. And if it's a specialized product, particularly a platelet that has an HLA typing on it, you're in a dilemma as to how to get that product to the patient who needs it, but yet get it into your system. So this is something you have to think about, and it is unprecedented, and it can be very, very challenging. Next slide. And that brings us to regulatory considerations. And you know that being compliant is very difficult when you're not sure what the weather is on that particular day. There was just an FDA Zoom meeting last night talking about CCP plasma and whether it's emergency use only or an IND and what is going on with that. And that's hot off the presses. I mean, they released saying that plasma could be administered under an emergency use allowance, and now they're saying that that there's a transition between those people that were under the IND with Mayo and transitioning that into this EUA. So you have your regular assessments that are coming in. Many of you have had those kinds of things delayed. They, for instance, I have found that the AABB currently is scheduling so that you know when they're coming. Although, and they will have at this point nothing unannounced. However, I got a notice from CAP last night asking me if I would do an unannounced inspection somewhere close to where I live. Now I'm not going to do it, but I thought, oh my, I thought they were all going to be scheduled. So anything can be happening and you just have to be ready for it. FDA is performing virtual desk assessments instead of coming in and doing an FDA inspection on site. What they're asking for is scanning requested documents, which usually amounts to 2 years worth of documentation, and they're giving people about 2 weeks to do it, which is very demanding. And you have to really understand what an emergency use allowance is. It's different than an IND. And last night, that was some of the conversation with the FDA. They were talking about if you are going to be under an IND, you don't have to worry about the antibody titer of the convalescent plasma, whereas under emergency use allowed, they're talking about perhaps titering that and having that be designated either high titer or low titer. But they would let us know in the future. So we don't really know yet. And again, here we are trying to manage change when we don't know from one day to the next what's happening. So we have to be flexible. Next slide. So what are some of the regulatory considerations for COVID-19 convalescent plasma? It's not an approved product. The convalescent plasma is fresh frozen plasma, and it is considered, the antibody that is present in that plasma is considered like an attribute, like CMV negative or sickle cell negative, that kind of thing. It's currently, up until Sunday, it was regulated as an investigational product, and administration was given under an IND, which Mayo will extend to the end of this month. So convalescent plasma can be still given under a traditional institutional IND, and many people have gone under the Mayo's IND, or it also can be a single patient emergency IND application. And now these slides obviously were done before Sunday. We can also be now administered as an EAU. So it's just stay tuned is all I can say. And I've included the link so that you can check what the changing weather is for the FDA and COVID-19 convalescent plasma. Next slide. Here are the ICPA codes for convalescent plasma. I'm not going to go over these, but as you can see, all I'm going to say is depending on how the plasma was collected determines the product code. And your blood center or supplier will generally tell you what they're collecting. And if you get something from another region that you don't have, they will have a different product code that you will end up having to set up in your computer system so that you can enter that product so that you can transfuse it. Next slide. So as Jean and I were preparing for this presentation, we talked about so many things, and we kind of just sat down and said, okay, what all has happened in the last 6 months? Because it has been extraordinarily dramatic for so many reasons. And convalescent plasma just being a part of all of the change. So what has happened? We've had new testing for COVID-19 antigen and antibody. We've had qualitative and quantitative testing from a multitude of different vendors. There have been testing that have been developed in-house, or they've been sent out, or the vendor has supplied it. There's been a new blood product, which is convalescent plasma. We've had medication availability and use of off-label medication for treatment of convalescent plasma, of COVID-19. PPE availability and supply chain challenges, as simple as cotton swabs that are sterile, trying to get them so that you could do the testing. Staffing adjustments, staffing shortages. There's been isolation protocols and quarantines that have been unprecedented. We've had ever-changing information about the virus, as well as availability of how to treat that virus. We've had virtual working from home. We've had homeschooling. If you have children, you've not only had to work from home, but you've also had homeschooling for your children, which, that's a challenge. I think there's been a new appreciation for our teachers in our children's lives these days, having homeschooling. And the personal impact on families have just really been a very personal kind of adjustment in not being able to visit families and not being able to, many people are separated from their children and grandchildren and weren't able to see them because of the quarantines. And one of the other things that I have seen that causes me to just breathe a sigh of relief is how creative people have been for solving challenging problems. And that has been the positive thing. And I think our lives have changed. I think we will, when we're all said and done, I think that we will have a new normal. And I'm not sure that it's going to be worse. It's just going to be a different kind of adjustment to how we function on a day-to-day basis. And I think we will appreciate things in a much broader sense as to how it impacts all of us. And Jean will wrap up the presentation. Jeannie?
Next slide, please.
Next slide.
So as I mentioned, the recovery phase is, recovery is one of the phases in a crisis management plan. So what does this entail? Well, it's necessary that we debrief afterwards, and even now as the process of the crisis is going on. We want to, you may want to keep a log, an ongoing log to review what worked, what didn't work, what were the surprises or the weaknesses. And as I said, not only do you want to look at it during the recovery process, but even on a daily basis, probably through those group huddles. Are there any lessons learned from addressing problems that should be adopted into routine operations or our new norm? And based on all of this information, we may want to revise our plan. And of course, you know, we need to test our plan. We may need to train staff or retrain them, and we need to practice the plan so that we have that added confidence of readiness before the next crisis. And of course, we want to communicate the plan. So while we don't know what new pandemic, crisis, or disaster will come next that's going to upend our business operations, we do know that change can be managed. And having a business continuity plan and a crisis management plans in place will certainly help. They may not be perfect, but they will provide guidance for how to prepare, respond, and recover in a crisis. And together, through constant communication and collaboration with our employees and our customers, we can and we will succeed. Next slide. So with that, I would like to say thank you on behalf of Mary, BC Solutions, and myself for attending the webinar. We don't really have time to take questions right now, but I would like to refer you to the email below, the webinars at bcsolutions.rfn.com. If you would send your questions there, we will be sure to answer them and get back to you. So once again, thank you so much for attending the webinar today.
And thank you, Jean and Mary, again, for your participation. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted on our website, bcsolutions.rfn.com, if you would like to view it at a later time. And thank you for attending.